For centuries, entire towns were built around holiness that did not exist. Sacred relics were manufactured, miracles were staged, pilgrimage routes were designed to extract money from belief. This was not isolated deception. It was a structured religious scam where faith became a market, sanctity became currency, and devotion became revenue. From medieval Europe to later reform movements, fabricated holy sites generated wealth, protected institutions, and reshaped economies. This is the story of how sacred geography was engineered and how belief was monetized. Holiness carried geographic weight. In medieval religious culture, proximity to the sacred was believed to alter spiritual outcome. Salvation was not only theological, it was spatial. A shrine, a tomb, a fragment of bone, or a reported site of revelation could transform ordinary land into divine territory. Pilgrimage was framed as repentance in motion. The journey itself carried merit. Arrival carried promise. Believers were taught that physical closeness to saints reduced suffering in the afterlife. Relics were believed to transmit healing power. Sacred soil was believed to carry divine presence. These claims required no scientific verification. They required institutional endorsement and collective acceptance. Spiritual authority validated geography. Geography then generated movement. Movement created economic concentration. Pilgrims traveled across regions and borders. They required food, shelter, candles, offerings, transport, and protection. Each act of devotion produced financial activity. Shrines accumulated donations in coin, land, livestock, and labor. Monasteries expanded their holdings. Cathedrals grew larger. Local markets formed around spiritual traffic. A recognized holy site immediately elevated a town's status. Political rulers aligned themselves with sacred locations to strengthen legitimacy. Religious institutions gained influence through custodianship of relics. Control over sanctity translated into control over revenue streams. Narratives reinforced belief. Miracle stories circulated through sermons and manuscripts. Testimonials were recorded and preserved by the same institutions benefiting from them. Few mechanisms existed for independent verification. Trust operated as default. To question sanctity was to risk moral suspicion. Social cohesion discouraged skepticism. Belief became infrastructure. It directed where people traveled. It determined where wealth accumulated. It concentrated authority in specific custodians. Holiness therefore functioned as an asset. An intangible claim produced tangible returns. Once a location achieved sacred recognition, its value multiplied. Pilgrimage routes became stable channels of recurring income. Reputation reinforced visitation. Visitation reinforced reputation. The promise of divine favor sustained demand. Where predictable demand exists, incentives follow. Where incentives strengthen, manipulation becomes possible. The system did not require universal deception. It required enough trust to sustain flow. In this environment, sanctity became convertible into economic power. That convertibility created the structural conditions for exploitation. Sacred geography converted belief into mapped territory. Once a location was declared holy, it gained fixed coordinates in collective consciousness. Pilgrimage routes began to formalize around these coordinates. Roads were cleared, bridges were maintained, way stations were constructed at regular intervals. Maps increasingly marked shrines as destinations. Religious calendars synchronized travel with feast days. Seasonal waves of movement became predictable. Predictability allowed planning. Local authorities invested in infrastructure near holy sites. Markets were positioned along primary approach roads. Inns multiplied near cathedral gates. Land values increased within walking distance of shrines. Donations were no longer incidental, they became anticipated revenue streams. Shrines introduced structured offering systems. Specific prayers required specific payments. Candles were sold in graduated sizes. Masses could be commissioned for fixed fees. Indulgences were priced according to spiritual promise. Accounting practices developed around sanctity. Monasteries recorded inflows in ledgers. Treasuries were expanded to manage surplus. Architectural expansion signaled legitimacy. Larger buildings implied greater holiness. Greater holiness attracted larger crowds. Narrative reinforced location. Chroniclers described miracles tied to specific ground. Art depicted saints anchored to identifiable settings. Pilgrimage badges were manufactured as proof of visitation. These tokens circulated across regions. They functioned as portable endorsements of authenticity. Reputation spread through returning travelers. Testimony amplified geographic branding. Sacred status became durable. Durability reduced scrutiny. The longer a shrine operated, the more legitimate it appeared. Geography transformed into asset class. Control of location meant control of flow. Control of flow meant control of wealth. Political rulers recognized this leverage. Some granted tax exemptions to sacred towns. Others redirected trade routes to intersect with shrines. Spiritual authority and economic strategy merged. Once institutionalized, sacred geography resisted challenge. Questioning a location threatened local livelihood. Communities defended sanctity to defend income. Belief no longer operated only in theology. It operated in land management. At this stage, holiness functioned as structured territory. Structured territory generated scalable returns. Scalable returns intensified incentive. Incentive created pressure to produce new sacred claims. By the 12th century, relic proliferation accelerated across Europe. Fragments of the true cross appeared in dozens of cities by 1200. Chroniclers quietly noted that the combined volume exceeded any plausible source, yet each fragment carried authentication from local clergy. In 1170, the death of Thomas Becket inside Canterbury Cathedral transformed the site immediately. By 1173, Becket was canonized. Miracle collections were compiled within months. Pilgrim numbers surged through the late 12th century. Canterbury badges were mass-produced by the 13th century. The economic transformation was measurable. In 1383, in the town of Wilsnack in Brandenburg, 3 communion wafers were reported to bleed after a church fire. The site quickly attracted pilgrims from across the Holy Roman Empire. Offerings increased dramatically within a decade. By the early 1400s, Wilsnack's Holy Blood had become one of Northern Europe's largest pilgrimage draws. Theological authorities debated its authenticity for decades. Financial incentives slowed decisive investigation. In 1294, the Holy House of Loreto was declared to have been miraculously transported from Nazareth to Italy. The structure became a major pilgrimage destination in the 14th and 15th centuries. Donations financed rapid architectural expansion. No verifiable transport mechanism was documented. The miracle narrative remained institutionally protected. Relic duplication extended beyond famous cases. Multiple churches claimed possession of the same saint's skull. Competing shrines asserted ownership of identical bones. Pilgrims rarely possessed means to verify provenance. Authentication relied on episcopal approval. Approval often aligned with local economic benefit. Miracle books were curated by shrine custodians. Testimonies emphasized healing, protection, and divine intervention.
Negative outcomes were not systematically recorded. Selective documentation reinforced legitimacy. As literacy expanded in the 15th century, printed indulgence certificates accompanied shrine visits. These documents formalized transaction. Sacred objects were cataloged. Access was regulated. Payments were tiered. Geography, narrative, and relic were bundled into a single devotional package. Demand remained strong. Verification remained weak. Institutional endorsement insulated scrutiny. By the late 15th century, relic markets operated at continental scale. What began as localized veneration had evolved into structured distribution of sanctified objects. Scale increased profit. Profit increased incentive. Incentive increased tolerance for fabrication. At this stage, false sanctity no longer required invention from nothing. It required strategic amplification of unverifiable claims.
By the 13th century, relic authentication had become a formalized process. Bishops issued written certificates validating sacred objects. These certificates often relied on tradition rather than investigation. Local economic impact influenced approval decisions. In 1238, King Henry III of England received a relic of the Holy Blood for Westminster. The ceremony reinforced royal legitimacy. No independent verification was recorded. In many regions, episcopal seals functioned as sufficient proof. Once sealed, relics entered circulation without further scrutiny. Monasteries competed to acquire prestigious objects. Prestige translated into pilgrimage volume. Pilgrimage volume translated into income. Income funded expansion of ecclesiastical estates. By the 14th century, shrine custodians maintained structured donation systems. Accounting books recorded offerings in detail. At Canterbury, financial records from the late 13th century show organized revenue tracking. Shrine income supported both clergy salaries and building programs. Incentives aligned clearly. Questioning a relic threatened institutional stability. Institutional stability protected relic narratives. In 1383, when doubts emerged about the Wilsnack bleeding hosts, regional clergy defended the shrine. Pilgrim traffic had already enriched the town. Intervention risked economic collapse. Theological commissions were convened. Investigations extended over decades. Final condemnation was delayed. Delay preserved revenue. In 1476, Pope Sixtus IV formally approved the cult of the Holy House of Loreto. Papal recognition amplified legitimacy. Recognition increased international pilgrimage. International pilgrimage increased political visibility. Political visibility discouraged reversal. Relic markets also produced duplication. Competing churches claimed identical sacred fragments. Admitting duplication would undermine credibility across regions. Mutual tolerance emerged. Silence functioned as risk management. By the late 15th century, indulgence distribution added another revenue layer. Authorized preachers were commissioned to sell indulgence certificates. Proceeds were often shared between local churches and central authorities. In 1510, Pope Leo X authorized indulgence sales to finance St. Peter's Basilica. Revenue targets were assigned. Spiritual language framed financial collection. Institutional scale intensified dependence on devotional income. Dependence reduced willingness to audit sacred claims. Sacred status became legally and politically entangled. Shrines operated within protection networks of bishops and rulers. Protection discouraged exposure. Economic integration hardened the system. Once embedded in political and fiscal structures, sanctity became difficult to disentangle from revenue. The incentive to preserve belief outweighed the incentive to verify. At this stage, fabrication no longer required secrecy. It required institutional alignment. Once a shrine achieved international recognition, local economies reorganized around it. After the canonization of Thomas Becket in 1173, Canterbury expanded rapidly. By the early 12th century, inns clustered along the primary approach roads.
Artisans specialized in producing pilgrimage badges and devotional souvenirs. Metal badge workshops operated at scale by the 1300s. Archaeological finds confirm mass production. Revenue from pilgrims supported urban growth. Markets aligned their operating days with feast calendars. Seasonal influxes created predictable commercial cycles. At Santiago de Compostela, documented pilgrimage growth between the 12th and 14th centuries reshaped the city. Hospices were constructed to house travelers. Merchants established permanent stalls along main processional streets. Land values near the cathedral increased relative to outer districts. Sacred proximity translated into premium pricing. In Loreto, after papal approval in 1476, construction expanded dramatically. The basilica grew through the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Donations funded large architectural projects. Pilgrim volume justified infrastructure expansion. Wilsnack experienced similar transformation after 1383. Road maintenance improved. Market privileges were granted. Town revenues became linked to shrine traffic. Municipal authorities therefore defended the miracle narrative. Economic dependency created political advocacy. Shrine towns negotiated tax privileges from rulers. Exemptions reinforced profitability. Guilds formed around pilgrim services. Candlemakers, innkeepers, guides, and relic sellers specialized in devotional commerce. Employment patterns adjusted to pilgrimage demand. During peak seasons, temporary labor surged. Credit networks extended to shrine districts. Merchants financed inventory based on expected pilgrim flow. Risk assessments assumed continuity of belief. Cathedral chapters managed treasury reserves to smooth seasonal volatility. Financial sophistication increased alongside devotional traffic. By the 15th century, some shrine towns functioned as single-industry economies. Spiritual tourism became primary income source. Dissent threatened livelihoods beyond clergy. A decline in pilgrim numbers affected merchants, laborers, and municipal tax bases. Economic entanglement strengthened resistance to scrutiny. Communities defended sanctity as economic survival. Belief was no longer only devotional, it was infrastructural. Sacred branding defined municipal identity. Town reputations were tied to miracle claims. External skepticism was framed as hostility. Internal questioning was socially costly. The more prosperous the shrine became, the greater the incentive to maintain its legitimacy. Prosperity increased collective risk exposure. If sanctity were discredited, collapse would be systemic. At this stage, fabricated holiness was embedded within entire urban economies.
Sustaining pilgrimage demand required continuous reinforcement. Miracles provided that reinforcement. At Canterbury, in the 1170s, monks compiled detailed miracle collections linked to Thomas Becket. These accounts documented healings, rescues, and divine interventions. The collections circulated in manuscript form across England and beyond. Each testimony strengthened the shrine's reputation. Public readings amplified impact. Wilsnack followed a similar pattern after 1383. Reports of bleeding hosts attracted pilgrims from across the Holy Roman Empire. Chroniclers recorded healing events tied to specific visits. The narrative focused on visible signs of divine presence. Miracles were geographically anchored. Physical proximity was emphasized. Testimony created social proof. Pilgrims returned home with stories. Stories traveled faster than verification. Printed pamphlets in the late 15th century expanded distribution. As printing technology spread after 1450, miracle narratives reached wider audiences. Standardized indulgence certificates reinforced transaction structure. In 1517, indulgence preaching campaigns across German territories used persuasive language tied to salvation timelines. Emotional urgency increased contribution rates. Visual theater reinforced legitimacy. Shrines displayed relics in elaborate ceremonies. Processions staged sacred objects before large crowds. Controlled lighting and incense heightened atmosphere. Authority figures endorsed the spectacle. Bishops presided. Local rulers attended. Attendance signaled approval. Badges functioned as portable validation. A badge confirmed physical presence at a shrine. Visibility of badges created peer influence. Communities interpreted accumulation of visitors as proof of authenticity. High traffic implied divine endorsement. Economic vitality became evidence of truth. Selective documentation reinforced positive outcomes. Failed healings were rarely archived. Contradictory testimony received limited circulation. Custodians curated narrative flow. Repetition normalized claims. Over time, familiarity reduced skepticism. Sacred status became self-reinforcing. The longer miracles were reported, the less they were questioned. Revenue stability depended on narrative continuity. Clergy invested in communication networks. Messengers carried announcements of feast days and new miracles. Trust expanded through repetition. Verification remained secondary. Incentives favored amplification over audit. By the early 15th century, miracle culture operated with continental reach. Faith, testimony, print, and ceremony formed an integrated system. Within this system, belief could be scaled. Scaled belief produced scalable income. Scalable income required constant narrative maintenance. At this point, the scam dynamic depended less on invention and more on sustained reinforcement. By the late 14th century, internal criticism began to surface. Concerns centered on the proliferation of relics. Some theologians questioned authenticity standards. In England, John Wycliffe wrote critically of indulgence practices in the 1370s. He argued that financial exchange distorted spiritual intent. His followers circulated reformist ideas despite institutional resistance. In Bohemia, Jan Hus criticized ecclesiastical corruption in the early 1400s. He condemned the commercialization of sacred practice. Hus was executed in 1415 at the Council of Constance. His death intensified reform sentiment across Central Europe. Dissent did not immediately dismantle shrine economies, but it introduced doctrinal tension. Relic duplication became harder to ignore. Multiple churches claimed identical sacred objects. Scholars quietly noted inconsistencies in provenance. At Wilsnack, investigations into the bleeding hosts continued through the 15th century. Theological commissions reviewed testimony. Debate slowed expansion. However, formal condemnation was delayed for decades. Delay reflected political caution. By the early 1500s, indulgence campaigns expanded aggressively. In 1515, indulgence sales were authorized to fund construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Preachers such as Johann Tetzel operated across German territories. Revenue targets were assigned. By 1517, exposure moved from isolated criticism to structural confrontation. Martin Luther's 95 Theses directly challenged indulgence financing. The document questioned the authority to sell spiritual remission. Printed copies spread across the Holy Roman Empire within weeks. Public discourse expanded beyond universities and clergy. Indulgence campaigns encountered resistance. Revenue streams slowed in contested territories. The challenge was no longer private, it was public and reproducible. Print technology amplified reform arguments. Pamphlets cataloged relic duplication. Satirical illustrations mocked miracle claims. Urban populations encountered competing interpretations of sanctity. Theological debate weakened automatic trust.
In Zurich during the 1520s, Huldrych Zwingli opposed relic veneration. Images were removed from churches. Pilgrimage activity declined. Local economies dependent on shrine traffic contracted. In parts of Germany, reform-aligned princes restricted indulgence sales. Shrines lost political protection. Institutional insulation weakened. In 1534, Henry VIII's Act of Supremacy redefined ecclesiastical authority in England. Royal control replaced papal oversight. Between 1536 and 1541, the dissolution of the monasteries redistributed church wealth. Treasuries were inventoried. Relics were catalogued and destroyed. In 1538, the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury was dismantled. Gold, jewels, and offerings were transferred to the crown. Pilgrimage routes ceased operation. Merchants near the cathedral lost primary income. Sacred branding no longer guaranteed protection. At Wilsnack, earlier debates culminated in suppression during Protestant reform. Miracle claims were stripped of endorsement. Without clerical validation, pilgrim flow evaporated. The market had relied on institutional credibility. When credibility fractured, demand collapsed. Exposure mechanisms combined theology, politics, and technology. Reformers reframed indulgence and relic trade as systemic corruption. Rulers calculated fiscal alternatives. Some redirected revenue through taxation reforms. Others absorbed former shrine assets into state control. Sacred geography became contested territory. Verification standards tightened in Catholic regions as well. The Council of Trent, convened in 1545, addressed relic veneration and indulgence abuses. Formal regulation increased. Documentation requirements strengthened. The era of unchallenged proliferation ended. Where reform succeeded, fabricated sanctity lost economic viability. Where reform was resisted, oversight increased. The structural protection that sustained false claims weakened across Europe. Exposure did not eliminate belief, it dismantled unchecked monetization. The scam dynamic unraveled where institutional alignment fractured. When institutional protection collapsed, shrine economies unraveled quickly. In 1538, the destruction of the shrine of Thomas Becket marked a decisive shift. For over 3 centuries, Canterbury had depended on Becket's cult. After the shrine was dismantled, pilgrimage traffic ended abruptly. Merchants near the cathedral lost core revenue. Inns reported decline. Badge workshops ceased production. Land values near the former shrine district stabilized downward. The economic contraction was visible. In Wilsnack, reform pressure during the 16th century ended the Holy Blood pilgrimage. Without official endorsement, the miracle narrative dissolved. The town's prominence faded. Trade linked to pilgrim flow contracted. Other German territories adopting Lutheran reform saw similar patterns. Relic collections were confiscated or destroyed. Indulgence campaigns were banned. Pilgrimage infrastructure fell into disuse. Markets built on sacred traffic required rapid adjustment. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 redistributed church lands to the crown and private elites. Former shrine revenues were absorbed into royal administration. Local communities lost ecclesiastical employment networks. Clerical households were disbanded. Dependent artisans relocated or diversified. The collapse was not theological alone, it was fiscal. Towns that had functioned as pilgrimage hubs were forced into economic restructuring. Some pivoted toward trade or agriculture. Others entered prolonged stagnation. Reputational damage compounded financial loss. Once relic claims were publicly discredited, credibility was difficult to restore. Trust, once broken, did not automatically regenerate. In Catholic territories that resisted Protestant reform, stricter verification mechanisms were introduced. Post-1545 reforms under the Council of Trent required clearer documentation of relic authenticity.
Unverified objects were removed from circulation. Miracle claims faced greater scrutiny. Institutional memory adjusted. The era of uncontrolled relic proliferation ended in many regions. Sacred markets did not disappear entirely. They contracted and professionalized. The most fragile shrines failed first. The most politically protected survived with regulation. Collapse revealed underlying dependency. Where entire towns relied on sanctity, exposure triggered systemic shock. The larger the pilgrimage flow, the greater the contraction. The scam dynamic proved vulnerable once institutional alignment fractured. Without coordinated endorsement, belief alone could not sustain economic scale. The removal of protection exposed structural fragility. Fabricated holiness required continuous reinforcement. When reinforcement stopped, the market corrected rapidly. What had appeared permanent revealed itself as contingent. After the collapse of major shrine economies, institutions recalibrated. The Catholic Church did not abandon relic veneration, it tightened control. Between 1545 and 1563, the Council of Trent addressed abuses tied to indulgences and relics. The council affirmed the legitimacy of relics. It simultaneously demanded clearer oversight. Unauthorized indulgence sales were curtailed. Local bishops were tasked with supervision. Documentation standards increased. Miracle claims required investigation before approval. Public display of relics became more regulated. The objective was stabilization. Institutional credibility required reconstruction. In Protestant territories, shrine-centered economies were replaced by alternative revenue models. State taxation expanded. Former monastic lands were redistributed to nobles and merchants. Sacred tourism no longer functioned as primary income. Urban centers that adapted diversified successfully. Others experienced prolonged contraction. In England, former monastic properties became part of emerging landed estates. Royal consolidation strengthened state authority. Fiscal centralization increased predictability. The elimination of indulgence markets removed a major transnational revenue stream. In German territories, Lutheran regions reorganized church finances under territorial rulers. Clergy salaries were funded through local taxation rather than pilgrimage income. This reduced dependence on spectacle. In Catholic regions, pilgrimage did not disappear, it was reframed. Authentication became more cautious. Miracle investigations were documented more thoroughly. Relic markets narrowed, scale decreased. The previous continental distribution of sanctified fragments slowed. Competition between shrines diminished. The post-Reformation religious landscape was more regulated. Sacred geography persisted, but under scrutiny. The long-term consequence was structural awareness. Institutions recognized the economic volatility tied to unchecked sanctity claims. Political authorities recognized the fiscal risk of dependence on pilgrimage traffic. The convergence of theology, print culture, and state power altered incentive structures. Unverified relic proliferation no longer carried the same immunity. The financial architecture of faith was redesigned. Markets attached to sanctity were formalized or restricted. The era of expansive, loosely verified holy site growth had ended. A new equilibrium emerged. Belief remained. Revenue mechanisms changed. The system absorbed the shock and recalibrated. But the memory of collapse lingered. Institutions now understood that monetized holiness carried structural risk. Unchecked expansion invited instability. Verification became not only theological necessity, but economic safeguard. History of fabricated holy sites reveals a structural pattern. Faith alone did not create the scam dynamic. Incentive alignment did. When spiritual authority defined geography, value concentrated. When value concentrated, revenue followed. When revenue became predictable, dependence formed. Dependence reduced scrutiny. Weak verification allowed amplification of unverifiable claims. Amplification generated scale. Scale attracted political protection. Political protection insulated further expansion. This sequence repeated across regions. In Canterbury after 1173, sanctity generated durable economic flow. In Wilsnack after 1383, miracle narrative created cross-regional traffic. In Loreto after 1294 and papal approval in 1476, architectural expansion signaled legitimacy. In 1515, indulgence campaigns tied revenue targets to spiritual promise. Each case combined intangible belief with tangible financial structure. None required universal conspiracy. They required institutional tolerance of profitable ambiguity. Where documentation was weak, narrative filled the gap. Where narrative attracted pilgrims, income stabilized. Where income stabilized, communities defended sanctity. The scam dynamic did not rely solely on fabrication. It relied on system reinforcement, geographic concentration, recurring pilgrimage flow, selective testimony, hierarchical endorsement, political alignment, limited audit mechanisms. When these conditions converged, monetized holiness scaled rapidly. Exposure occurred only when external pressure disrupted alignment. Print technology enabled reproducible criticism. Reform movements fractured doctrinal unity. State authorities recalculated fiscal interests. Once protection weakened, verification increased. Markets corrected. The pattern demonstrates structural vulnerability. Any institution that monetizes intangible claims without independent oversight accumulates risk. Economic dependency narrows tolerance for investigation. Community livelihood becomes tied to belief continuity. Questioning sanctity becomes socially and politically costly. Over time, the distinction between devotion and revenue blurs. Faith itself is not the variable. Institutional design is. Where incentives reward amplification more than verification, exploitation emerges. Where oversight strengthens, abuse contracts. The historical record from the 12th through the 16th centuries illustrates this progression clearly. Sacred geography became market infrastructure. Market infrastructure generated wealth. Wealth generated protection. Protection delayed correction. When correction arrived, collapse was rapid. The structural lesson is consistent. Belief combined with unchecked monetization creates systemic exposure. Verification mechanisms are not enemies of faith. They are stabilizers of institutions. When faith intersects with markets, safeguards determine whether devotion remains spiritual practice or becomes structured scam.